Get out before I have security escort you out of this building. The words sliced clean through the polished silence of the 38th floor boardroom, and every head turned not toward the billionaire who said them, but toward the young woman standing near the glass doors. Naomi Carter didn't move. Her visitor badge swayed slightly against her chest, catching the reflection of the city skyline behind her, a skyline she had only ever seen from the outside looking in. Edward Hale didn't even bother to look at her twice, his attention already drifting back to the thick contract laid open in front of him, pages filled with numbers large enough to change lives, or end them. The executives seated around the table shifted in their leather chairs, some with faint smirks, others avoiding eye contact entirely, because everyone in that room understood one thing: people like Naomi didn't interrupt meetings like this. Not in a room where deals were measured in hundreds of millions of dollars and silence was a form of power. But Naomi's voice came anyway, steady, controlled, almost too calm for someone being dismissed. If you sign that, you're not buying a company, you're absorbing their liabilities. A quiet ripple moved across the table, subtle, almost invisible, like a change in pressure before a storm. Edward's pen paused just slightly above the signature line, not enough for anyone to call it hesitation, but enough to exist. He exhaled slowly, setting the pen down with deliberate precision, then leaned back in his chair, finally lifting his eyes to her, cold, assessing, distant. "You're an intern," he said, his tone flat, not loud, not angry, just dismissive in a way that carried more weight than shouting ever could. "You don't get to speak in this room." Naomi felt the heat rise in her chest, not from fear, but from something older, something buried deep in memory. Contracts like this, language like this, she had seen what it could do. She had lived through the aftermath of someone trusting the wrong line on the wrong page, but her face didn't show it. She only took a small step forward, just enough to be seen clearly under the overhead lights. "Page 14, she said, her voice quieter now, but sharper. "Subsection C, it shifts post-merger liability entirely onto your side." A few executives glanced down instinctively, fingers brushing pages. One man adjusted his glasses, another leaned closer to the document, but Edward didn't look down, not yet. His gaze stayed locked on Naomi as if the paper itself was beneath consideration. "That's enough," he said, sharper this time, the air tightening instantly. "You've said more than you should have already." A faint chuckle came from somewhere along the table, quickly stifled. Naomi's fingers curled slightly at her sides, but she didn't retreat. "You think you're acquiring assets," she continued, each word measured. "But you're stepping into every lawsuit they're trying to escape." The room didn't laugh this time, it didn't move at all, and for a fraction of a second, something flickered across Edward Hale's face, not doubt, not yet, but awareness, the kind that arrives before a man decides whether to listen or to double down, and Edward chose. He stood, slow, controlled, the kind of movement that didn't need force to command the room. "Get out," he repeated, quieter now, more final. "No." The word landed heavier than before. Naomi held his gaze for 1 second longer, long enough for something unspoken to pass between them, then she turned, the glass door opening with a soft mechanical hiss, and as it closed behind her with a precise, echoing click, the room felt different, not louder, not softer, just off. Edward remained standing for a moment, staring at the contract again, the pen still resting where he had left it, the skyline reflecting faintly across the polished table, and somewhere beneath the weight of numbers and authority, a single line of text waited to be read or ignored. Naomi stepped into the service hallway as the doors sealed behind her, the sharp click still echoing in her ears like a verdict that had already been decided. The air outside the boardroom felt different, colder, thinner, like the building itself had rules about who belonged where. She exhaled slowly, unclenching her hands as she walked past a row of stainless steel cabinets that reflected her in fragments, her badge, her worn sneakers, the crease in her sleeve where she had pressed it that morning hoping it would look just a little more professional, just enough to blend in, just enough to be invisible. But invisible had never been the problem, not really. She had been invisible her whole life, in classrooms where teachers skipped over her raised hand, in offices where her name was forgotten before introductions ended, in systems designed so that people like her were not expected to understand, only to follow. And yet she understood too much. Her mind replayed the lines she had seen on page 14, the phrasing, the structure, the quiet shift of responsibility hidden beneath legal language that sounded harmless to anyone not looking closely. She had seen that pattern before, years ago, sitting at a kitchen table covered in unpaid bills while her father stared at a document just like that one. His voice tired, confused, saying it looked fine, saying the lawyer had approved it, saying they would be okay. And then they were not. Everything changed after that, the house, the jobs, the silence that settled into their lives like dust that never fully cleared. Naomi reached the end of the hallway and paused by a narrow window overlooking the street 38 floors below. Cars moved in slow lines, people crossing intersections without ever looking up, unaware of the decisions being made above them. Decisions that could ripple outward without warning. She pressed her palm lightly against the cool glass, grounding herself, reminding herself why she had spoken in the first place. It was never about proving anyone wrong, it was about stopping the same mistake from happening again, even if no one wanted to hear it. Back inside the boardroom, the silence lingered longer than expected. One executive cleared his throat quietly, another adjusted the stack of papers in front of him. But no one spoke first, because something had shifted, small but undeniable. Edward Hale finally lowered his gaze to the contract, his fingers brushing the edge of the page Naomi had mentioned. He did not rush, did not react outwardly, but his eyes moved slower now, more deliberate. Scanning each line as if seeing it for the first time. The numbers had not changed, the structure had not changed, but the context had. The phrase, post-merger liability, sat there in plain text, neutral, almost forgettable, until it was not. A faint crease formed between his brows, subtle enough that most would miss it, but it was there. One of the executives leaned slightly forward, voice cautious. "Sir, should we review that section again?" Edward did not answer immediately. His pen rested untouched beside the document, the weight of the room pressing in, not loud, not chaotic, just heavy with the possibility that something important had been overlooked. And in that stillness, the absence of Naomi Carter became louder than her presence had ever been. Edward Hale did not sign. The pen remained exactly where it was, resting parallel to the contract as if even it had decided to wait. The room stayed still, no one reaching for coffee, no one whispering, just the faint hum of the building's ventilation system filling the silence. He flipped back one page, then forward again, slower this time, his eyes narrowing not in anger but in calculation. The kind that had built his empire deal by deal, line by line, nothing rushed, nothing assumed. Page 14, he said quietly, not looking up, and immediately 3 executives shifted, one turning pages too fast, another pulling the document closer as if proximity could reveal truth faster. A legal advisor leaned forward, adjusting his glasses, scanning the clause Naomi had mentioned, his lips pressing together in a thin line. Edward tapped the paper once with his finger, not loud, but enough to anchor every eye in the room to that exact spot. "Explain this wording," he said, and it was not a question. The advisor hesitated, just a fraction too long, then cleared his throat. "It appears to be a standard liability allocation," he began, but his voice lacked the certainty it carried earlier. Edward's gaze lifted slightly, sharp now. "Appears," he repeated, and the single word stretched across the room like tension pulled too tight. The advisor swallowed, flipping the page again, slower, more carefully, as if hoping the meaning might change under closer inspection. Another executive leaned in, tracing the paragraph with his finger, reading silently, then stopping, his posture stiffening almost imperceptibly. "Sir," he said cautiously, "if this interpretation is correct, then any unresolved claims transfer entirely to us after closing." No one spoke after that, not immediately. The implication settled in layers, quiet but heavy. Edward leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking softly beneath him, his eyes no longer on the contract but somewhere beyond it, piecing together numbers, risks, outcomes, the kind of silent arithmetic that determined whether fortunes were preserved or erased. He reached for the pen again, not to sign, but to turn it slowly between his fingers, a habit he had when something did not align, something he had missed, something that should not have been missed. "Run the projections," he said, voice controlled, steady, and instantly a tablet lit up across the table, fingers moving quickly now, pulling data, recalculating exposure, adjusting models. The screen reflected in Edward's eyes as numbers shifted, scenarios updated, and then the result appeared, not dramatic, not explosive, just a quiet figure at the bottom of the screen, a potential loss large enough to erase years of growth. The room did not react outwardly, but the silence deepened. One executive leaned back, exhaling slowly. Another removed his glasses, rubbing the bridge of his nose. Edward set the pen down again, this time with finality, his jaw tightening just slightly, not in panic, not in fear, but in recognition, because he understood now, not just the clause, not just the risk, but the moment he had chosen to ignore the one voice that saw it clearly. His gaze shifted toward the glass doors, still closed, still reflecting the skyline, and for the first time since the meeting began, the absence outside that door felt like a mistake that could not be undone as easily as turning a page. Edward Hale stood up slowly, the chair sliding back with a soft, controlled scrape that sounded louder than it should have in the quiet room. No one spoke, not because they did not have questions, but because they were waiting, watching, recalculating their own positions in a deal that had just shifted beneath their feet. He did not raise his voice this time, did not need to. "Stop all signing procedures," he said, each word measured, deliberate, and immediately the tension changed direction. Assistants paused mid-note, one executive lowered his tablet, another leaned back as if distance from the table might distance him from the risk now unfolding. Edward walked around the table, not fast, not rushed, but with purpose, his hand brushing lightly against the polished surface as he moved, the reflection of the skyline bending across the glass like a distorted mirror of control slipping out of alignment. He stopped at the head of the table and looked down again at the contract. But this time he was not reading, he was remembering, the exact moment he dismissed her, the exact tone, the exact certainty. And how quickly certainty could become liability. "Who reviewed this final draft?" he asked. And the question landed heavier than any accusation. The legal advisor straightened, clearing his throat again, but this time there was no polished confidence behind it, only calculation and caution. "Our internal team and external counsel signed off on it," he replied carefully. Edward's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in recognition of something deeper than a simple oversight, something designed, something intentional. He tapped the clause again, slower now. "This is not an error," he said quietly, and that changed everything, because an error could be corrected, but intention meant strategy, meant someone had placed that line there knowing exactly what it would do. The room absorbed that realization in silence. One executive shifted uncomfortably, another avoided eye contact entirely. The weight of the deal now felt different, heavier, no longer an opportunity, but a calculated risk that had nearly been accepted without question. Edward turned his head slightly toward the glass doors, his reflection faint beside the city beyond, and for a brief moment, the room faded behind him, replaced by a single image, Naomi Carter standing there, steady, certain, saying the one thing no one else had, not louder, not stronger, just clearer. He inhaled slowly, then looked back at the table. "Find her," he said, and the instruction cut through the room with precision. An assistant hesitated, just for a second, as if unsure whether he meant it. Edward did not repeat himself, he did not need to, the tone had already shifted, authority now redirected. "She was right," he added, quieter, but somehow more powerful than anything he had said before, and in that moment, the hierarchy in the room adjusted, not visibly, not dramatically, but enough that everyone understood. The person they had dismissed was now the only one who had seen the truth before it was too late, and somewhere down the hallway, far from the polished table and the filtered light, Naomi Carter was walking away, unaware that the decision made behind her had just begun to reverse everything. Naomi Carter did not look back as she walked through the service corridor, her steps steady, measured, as if each one carried her further away from something she had already decided to leave behind. The hum of fluorescent lights followed her down the narrow hallway, reflecting off the tiled floor in dull, repeating patterns. She reached the employee elevator and pressed the button once, not impatient, just certain. Her reflection stared back at her in the brushed metal doors, slightly warped. Like the version of herself that had stood in that boardroom did not quite belong to this space anymore, the elevator arrived with a soft chime, doors sliding open to reveal an empty car. She stepped inside and pressed the ground floor, the numbers above the panel lighting up one by one as the descent began. 38, 37, 36, each floor marking distance not just in space, but in consequence. She leaned lightly against the wall, exhaling slowly, the adrenaline fading. Replaced by something quieter, heavier, not regret, but acceptance. She had said what needed to be said, whether they listened or not had never been something she could control. The elevator reached the lobby, doors opening to a wide marble space filled with polished surfaces and distant conversations. People moved with purpose, suits, briefcases, heels clicking against the floor, none of them noticing her as she stepped out, blending once again into the background she had always known. Near the security desk, a guard glanced up briefly, then returned to his screen. Routine uninterrupted, Naomi adjusted the strap of her bag on her shoulder and headed toward the glass exit doors. Sunlight filtered through from outside, warmer than anything inside the building, just as her hand reached the door handle. A voice echoed from behind, sharp, urgent. "Miss Carter." She paused, not turning immediately, the sound of hurried footsteps closing the distance across the marble floor. A young assistant, slightly out of breath, stopped a few feet behind her, holding a tablet tightly against his chest. "Mr. Hale wants you to come back upstairs," he said, trying to steady his voice. Naomi slowly turned, her expression calm, unreadable. "Why?" she asked, simple, direct. The assistant hesitated, glancing briefly over his shoulder as if expecting someone else to answer for him, but no one did. "He reviewed the contract," he said finally. "He said you were right?" The words hung in the air between them, unexpected, almost unreal in their simplicity. Naomi studied him for a moment, not surprised, not satisfied, just quiet, processing. She looked past him toward the elevators, then back toward the glass doors leading outside, sunlight still waiting on the other side. The choice sat there, small but significant: return to the place that had just dismissed her, or keep walking towards something unknown but hers. The assistant shifted slightly, uncertain. "He asked specifically for you," he added, softer now. Naomi's hand remained on the door handle, her fingers resting lightly against the cool metal, and for a moment, time seemed to pause between two directions, one that had already shown her exactly how little she was valued, and one that had no guarantees at all. She inhaled slowly, her reflection faintly visible in the glass, then released the handle, turning fully to face the assistant, not rushed, not pressured, just deliberate, and without a word, she began walking back toward the elevators, the sound of her footsteps echoing softly across the marble floor as the distance between who she was and what she was about to become began to close. The elevator doors closed with a soft, airtight seal, and Naomi Carter stood alone inside as the numbers above the panel began to climb again, one floor at a time, slow, steady, unavoidable. She did not press her back against the wall this time, did not look down at her reflection. Instead, her eyes stayed fixed on the glowing numbers, watching them rise as if each one carried a different version of what might be waiting for her upstairs. 32, 33, 34, the faint hum of the cables echoed through the confined space, a mechanical rhythm that felt almost like a countdown, not to something dramatic, but to something quiet, something that would not announce itself with noise. She adjusted her grip on the strap of her bag, her fingers steady, no shaking, no hesitation, because this was not new to her. Walking into rooms where she was not expected, speaking when she was not invited, being heard only after being dismissed. The pattern was familiar. What was different now was not the room, not the people, but the fact that this time, the truth had already been proven before she stepped back in. The elevator slowed slightly, a subtle shift in motion as it approached the upper floors. 36, 37, 38. The doors opened to the same hallway, the same polished floor, the same filtered light pouring in through the glass walls, but the air felt different now, heavier, more aware. As if the building itself had registered the change. The assistant who had called her back stood a few feet away, waiting, no longer rushed, no longer uncertain, just watching. He did not speak this time, only nodded once and gestured toward the boardroom. Naomi walked forward, her steps measured, the sound of her shoes soft against the floor, each one echoing just enough to be heard, not loud, but present. The glass doors came into view again, reflecting her image clearly now. No distortion, no blur, just her, standing exactly where she had been minutes before, but not the same, not entirely. She paused for half a second, not out of doubt, but out of awareness. Then the door opened, and the room inside was no longer the same room she had left. The silence was still there, but it had shifted. It was no longer dismissive, no longer indifferent. It was attentive, focused, waiting, every seat still filled, every pair of eyes now turning toward her as she stepped inside. No one laughed, no one whispered, no one looked away. Edward Hale stood near the head of the table, not seated this time. Not distant, his posture different, less relaxed, more deliberate. The contract still lay open on the table, but the pen was no longer beside it. It had been moved aside, a small detail, almost invisible, but clear enough to mean something had changed. Naomi walked forward until she reached the same spot she had stood before, her hands resting calmly at her sides, her expression unchanged, steady, composed. She did not speak first, did not fill the silence, because this time the silence belonged to them, and Edward finally stepped forward. His voice when it came was lower, controlled, but no longer dismissive. "Explain it," he said, not a command, not an order, but a request shaped by realization. The room remained still, waiting, and Naomi Carter, standing in the same place she had just been told to leave, now held the one thing no one else in that room could claim, the clarity they had missed. Naomi did not rush to answer. She stepped closer to the table, her eyes scanning the open contract as if she had never left, as if the interruption had simply paused a conversation that was always meant to continue. The overhead lights reflected softly across the page, illuminating the exact clause she had pointed out before. She reached out, not touching the paper yet, just hovering above it, giving the room a moment to follow her gaze. "It is not just the wording," she said finally, her voice calm, even carrying without force. "It is where it is placed." A few executives leaned in slightly, not out of skepticism this time, but attention, real attention, the kind that had been absent before. Naomi lowered her hand and pointed precisely to the paragraph. "This section looks like a standard compliance adjustment, something routine," she continued, "but the language redirects all unresolved liabilities after the merger closes, not proportionally, not conditionally, entirely." The legal advisor shifted in his chair, his fingers tightening slightly around his pen. Naomi did not look at him. She kept her focus on the document, on the logic, on the structure. "It is designed to pass a surface review," she added, "because everything around it appears normal." Edward's gaze followed every word, every movement, not interrupting, not questioning, just listening, something he had not done minutes ago. Naomi turned one page back, then forward again, her motions slow, deliberate. "If you compare this clause to the previous draft," she said, "the wording was different. It shared risk, balanced exposure." She tapped the page lightly. "This version removes that balance." A quiet shift moved through the room. One executive pulled up an earlier draft on his tablet, scrolling quickly, then stopping, his expression tightening as he compared the language side by side. "She is right," he said under his breath, almost to himself. Naomi continued, her voice steady, not rising, not pushing. "Once the deal closes, any legal action tied to their existing operations becomes yours." She paused briefly, letting the implication settle. "You are not acquiring a company, you are inheriting every unresolved problem they have not disclosed." The room remained silent, but the silence had changed again. It was no longer uncertain. It was understanding. Edward stepped closer to the table, his hand resting near the contract but not touching it, his jaw set, his eyes focused not on Naomi now, but on the reality unfolding in front of him. "How much?" he asked, his voice lower, controlled. Naomi did not hesitate. "Based on their public filings and the gaps in this clause," she said, "potential exposure could exceed $300 million within the first 18 months. The number did not echo. It did not need to. It settled heavily into the room, visible in the stillness of every person present. Edward exhaled slowly, not sharply, not dramatically, just enough to release the weight of a decision he had almost made. His gaze lifted back to Naomi, and for a brief moment, something unspoken passed between them, not apology, not yet, but recognition, clear and undeniable, the kind that does not need words to exist. Naomi stepped back slightly, her hands returning to her sides, her posture unchanged. She had not raised her voice, had not demanded attention, had not forced anything. She had simply shown them what was already there, and in doing so, she had shifted the entire room without ever needing to claim it. No one spoke for a long moment after the number settled into the room. $300 million did not need repetition, it carried its own weight, its own gravity. Edward Hale remained still, his hand resting on the edge of the table as if grounding himself in something solid while everything else shifted. The skyline behind him stretched wide through the glass, bright, distant, indifferent. He looked down at the contract once more. But this time there was no calculation left, no scenario to test, only a decision that had already been made by the truth laid out in front of him. He reached forward and closed the document slowly, the sound of paper meeting paper soft but final, a quiet end to something that had almost begun. The room seemed to exhale with him, subtle, controlled, but undeniable. One executive leaned back, another removed his glasses entirely, placing them on the table as if seeing clearly now required nothing else. Edward lifted his gaze to Naomi, not quickly, not sharply, but with intention, the kind that does not come from authority, but from recognition. "You stop this," he said, his voice lower than before, stripped of the distance it carried earlier. Naomi did not respond immediately. Her posture remained steady, her expression unchanged, not seeking acknowledgement, not expecting it, just present. Edward took a step closer, closing the physical space between them by a few feet, a small movement, but one that shifted the dynamic more than any words could. "We would have signed it," he continued, quieter now, almost to himself. "Today." The realization hung there, not dramatic, not loud, just real, and heavier because of it. Naomi's eyes met his briefly, calm, clear, without accusation, without pride. "Then it is good you did not," she said simply, her voice even, as if the outcome mattered more than who was right. Edward nodded once, slow, deliberate, absorbing not just the situation, but the way she carried it. No demand for credit, no attempt to elevate herself, just truth. He glanced back at the table, then at the executives who had once filled the room with certainty, now quiet, attentive, recalibrating, and for the first time, he did not lead with them. He turned back to Naomi instead. "What is your background?" he asked, not out of formality, but necessity. Naomi hesitated for a fraction of a second, not because she did not have an answer, but because she understood the weight behind the question. "I studied finance," she said. "I did not finish." Her words were straightforward, without embellishment, without defense. Edward's brows shifted slightly, not in judgment, but in reconsideration of everything he had assumed. "And yet you saw what none of us did," he said, more to himself than to her. Naomi did not respond to that, because it was not something that needed explanation. Some things were not about credentials, but perspective, experience, and the willingness to look where others did not. Edward stood there for a moment longer, then made a decision that did not require consultation, did not require approval. "You are not leaving," he said, his tone calm, but firm in a different way than before, not dismissive, not commanding, but certain. The room shifted again, subtle but clear. Naomi held his gaze, her expression unchanged. "That is not my decision to make," she replied quietly, and in that moment, the power in the room did not belong to the man who had built the company, but to the woman who had nothing to prove, because she already had something far more valuable, the truth that had just saved them all. The room did not move after she said it, not immediately. The air held still between them as if even the walls were waiting to see what would happen next. Edward Hale stood there, his authority still present, but no longer unquestioned, no longer absolute, because something quieter had entered the space and settled deeper than power ever could. He looked at Naomi Carter, really looked this time, not at her badge, not at her position, but at the calm certainty in the way she stood. the way she had spoken without needing to raise her voice, without needing permission, and for a moment, the room faded again. Replaced by a realization that did not come with noise, only with weight. He had built everything in this building by trusting his instincts, by reading people, by seeing what others missed, and yet today, the one person who saw the truth first was the one he had dismissed without a second thought. He exhaled slowly, not as a sign of defeat, but of understanding, then stepped back, creating space where there had been pressure. "Then we will make it your decision," he said, his voice steady, not forcing, not commanding, just offering something that had not been offered before. Respect, the word was not spoken, but it was there, clear in the shift of tone, the shift of posture, the shift of everything that had defined this room minutes ago. Naomi did not answer right away. Her eyes moved briefly across the table, the executives, the contract now closed, the pen set aside, all of it still, all of it waiting. Then she looked back at him, not with hesitation, not with pride, but with the same quiet clarity she had carried from the beginning. "I did not come here to stay," she said, her voice soft, but unwavering, and the words landed gently, without challenge, without resistance, just truth. Edward nodded once, slower this time, as if accepting something larger than a simple response. "And yet you changed everything in this room," he replied, not to persuade, not to argue, but to acknowledge. Naomi did not react to that either, because change had never been her goal, only the truth had been. She stepped back slightly, the distance small, but meaningful, as if returning the room to what it had been before she entered it, or perhaps leaving it better than she found it. "Then do not forget what you almost signed," she said quietly, her eyes steady on his, not accusing, not warning, just reminding. Edward held her gaze for a moment longer, then nodded again, this time without words, because there was nothing left to say that would matter more than what had already been understood. Naomi turned, her movement calm, unhurried, and walked toward the glass doors. No one stopped her, no one called her back, because for the first time, the room did not need to hold her to recognize her value. The doors opened with a soft mechanical breath, and as she stepped through, the light from the hallway wrapped around her figure. Then the doors closed again with that same precise, quiet click. Edward remained where he was, standing beside the table, the contract in front of him now just paper, nothing more. His hand rested lightly on its surface, not to claim it, but to feel the weight of what it had almost become. The skyline stretched beyond the glass, unchanged, indifferent, but inside the room something had shifted permanently, not loud, not visible, just present, like a silence that carried meaning long after the words had ended.